So this is a different kind of video than we usually do. This isn't about like history or practice and how to, so on and so forth. This is about theory, right? And this is about questions that I have that I can't find answers to. Maybe you have the answers. But it's a good discussion, and it's something that's been like occupying a good part of my headspace for the last, I don't know, several weeks. So I figured, let's just do a video on this. And it has to do with dynos. So before I go any further, right, I have to, obviously you got to do the disclaimer, you know. I have nothing against dynos. I watch all the dyno videos. I love dynos. If I had a dyno, you wouldn't be able to get me off of it. I'd be on it all the time because it's a cool tool to have. It's a good tool to have. In the new shop, next year, I'd like to add a dyno, a chassis dyno. So we have to, like I said, the disclaimer, let's get this out of the way. You know, nothing against dynos. All right. My question is how the dynos are used. So, you know, in the old days, when you questioned an orthodoxy, it was like the quick way to get burned at the stake. So, I mean, I could already see the flames in the comments, right? But I'm not really challenging an orthodoxy, but so much asking about a different dimension, something that isn't talked about. And here's what led to this train of thought in my head. I've noticed that a lot of theories get tested on the dyno, and very often the results are not what you would expect them to be, or they're contradictory to what has been known as like standard practices. And to go into each specific one would require its own discussion, right, all by itself, and that would like kind of like muddle the question here. So the question is, in terms of what we do as hot rodders, and hot rodding revolves around drag racing, and drag racing is an acceleration game. In terms of what we do as hot rodders, how accurate are dyno results? How accurate is a dyno test? Because as I had a discussion with a very well-known dyno operator, a friend of mine, and we went back and forth, and it almost became a bit of an argument, a debate. And he couldn't answer the question, and I couldn't answer the question. And then I started researching, and there are no questions, or there's no way to answer the question. The dyno is a measure of volumetric efficiency, but not how you arrive at that volumetric efficiency. That's where the shovel comes in. So, I'll give you an example. Let's go in the backyard. So this discussion revolved around what exactly is a dyno measuring. And in practice, okay, a dyno is measuring how much dirt can I put in the shovel and how far can I move it in X amount of time, right? But what the dyno doesn't take into consideration is the transition. See, the dyno is measuring the shovel full of dirt, and now I'm going to throw the shovel full of dirt, and that's going to be our number. That's going to be our result. But the dyno doesn't take into account transition. In other words, the shovel is empty, just like the car is sitting there at the starting line, right? The dyno doesn't take into consideration whether you're gathering your dirt this way, right, and filling up the shovel, or this way. One is far more efficient and quick. That's the transition. The dyno does not measure transition. Now let's go back inside. So that's a headful, right? It doesn't measure transition. And by the very definition of acceleration is transition. It's not speed. Speed is what you attain after you've accelerated. Transition is the acceleration itself. Now, picture how, I know you've seen 1,000 dyno videos, right? Picture how a dyno video is done. And then an engine is brought to its predetermined RPM where the test is going to start. So let's say it's 2,500 RPM, 3,000 RPM, whatever it happens to be. The engine is brought to full throttle and held against the dyno, all right? Okay. Just like a converter. It's held against the converter, let's just say. Now, the dyno allows the engine to rise at a predetermined rate. So if it's like 200 RPM a second, 300, 600, whatever it happens to be, it doesn't matter. The dyno is controlling the rate of acceleration of the engine. But what the dyno is doing is not measuring how quickly it gets to the next point. The dyno is determining how quickly it's allowed to get to the next point. The dyno is just telling you how much output that motor is making at any given time. And then those dots are connected and there's your chart. Here's a practical example that anybody can relate to, right? Now remember, the dyno test starts with the engine at full throttle. So let's just say you have no accelerator pump. You've taken the accelerator pump off the carburetor of this engine and then you're going to dyno test it, right? It's not going to have any effect. The engine is brought gradually to full throttle under almost no load. So there's no problem. It hits the load. It's already accelerated. It's already moved to that point. So now you can run this dyno test. There's no need for an accelerator pump. But now let's say you take that same exact engine off the dyno, it makes 500 horsepower, and you put it in a 3,000 pound car, and it should go 1150, right, without batting an eye. But you take the engine minus the accelerator pump, drop it in the car, and go. What happens when you hit the gas? It runs an infinite ET, because as soon as you hit the gas, it drops dead. So you could take that same scenario and let's say tuning it with an accelerator pump. Is it too lean? Is it too rich? You know, is there a bog? Is there a stumble? Right? All of those things would count in the car's real world acceleration, but it wouldn't count on the dyno sheet because the dyno is loading the motor at full throttle and bringing it gradually up through its RPM range to find its peak volumetric efficiency. Interesting stuff, right? You never thought of it this way. In a perfect world, and this is one of the things that I brought up in this discussion I was having, in a perfect world, the dyno would crash into the load, the same way it would on a drag strip, let's just say, where the car is sitting stationary, and you're going to mat it, and the motor's going to run into the converter, or the motor's going to come against the clutch, and it's going to get loaded, and it's how that engine now attacks the load, and attacks the mass of the car as it accelerates. But none of that is taken into consideration on a dyno. The dyno is exactly accurate if you're dealing with a steady state RPM or a narrow range RPM application. So let's say circle track racing or land speed racing, where you're measuring the aerodynamic drag against the motor, against the car, I should say. How well is it going to overcome that load? There's where that power comes from. But in terms of drag racing, if you use that example, and the fact that the dyno does not measure transition, well then the only place on a drag strip where your dyno number would be exactly accurate would be the single revolution the engine makes, or 2 revolutions because it's a 4-stroke, at the exact stripe, at the exact instant that you're about to back off the throttle. It would only count for those 2 revolutions of the engine's output. Everything else is subject to transition, which the dyno doesn't measure. Crazy, right? Okay, so like I said, I have no answers for this. I'm in a process of trying to find the answers myself. Is there a way to do this? According to the dyno operator I talked to, no. There's just not, it's not done. Engines are not crashed into the load on a dyno the way they are on a drag strip. So how do you accurately, without putting it in the car and using the drag strip itself as the dyno, which ultimately is always, there's another thing too. They, for instance, give an example of the oil tests, where they'll put a predetermined amount of oil in an engine and find, where where's peak and where does it fall off, but where's the acceleration in that? That oil is not stagnant in the pan. Under acceleration, that oil's doing crazy things. That 4 quarts, how much of it is now getting stacked against the back of the crank, whipped up into the reciprocating assembly, and not there in, So like there's so many different aspects to this. Things that can't be accurately measured on a dyno, but things that we as hot rodders or drag racers take for granted as being like, well, this is the way it's done. So, like I said, I have no answers. I only have questions. And I think it's something that, if you're a real gearhead, you're really into this stuff, it's something you might want to ponder too. And perhaps on one of our upcoming lives, our Sunday Night Lives or our Wednesday Night Tech Talks, If you have any ideas, jump in there and let's throw it around. I'm curious. It's something I really want to know. I'll see you tomorrow.